Firstly, because it's Zoom, same as always, if you could just stay on mute, that would be wonderful. Also, we are recording tonight, so if you would rather not have your face seen, then just turn off your video. Equally, if you at any point want to have a Zoom break, we understand that. We'd love to see your lovely faces, but if you'd rather sit with your video off, that's totally understandable. Did I have anything? Yes. If you have any questions, we will be doing a Q&A at the end, and we will open it up and ask you to put a Q in the chat box or to raise your hand, and you will be able to ask questions to the panelists. So now it's a great pleasure to introduce our fantastic playwright, Polly Creed.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to you all for joining. I know, especially after work, it's probably in many ways the last thing you want to be doing, to be spending more time on Zoom. But we do have an amazing evening this lined up with some fantastic speakers. So thank you so much for all your support, especially as at the moment it's a pretty rocky time for theatre, and we've had kind of postponements and things. So it's wonderful to kind of be telling the story of Humane and kind of speaking to you all tonight. I'd like to thank in particular Cheryl Robson from Aurora Metro, for the publisher of Humane, for all her support and for hosting this event. Thank you, Cheryl. I thought I'd begin just by telling everyone a little bit about Humane and sort of how I came to tell the story. So it was a long time ago that it began, 10 years in fact, and I was still at school when this idea started. And my best friend at the time, was still best friend, Daisy Blower, kind of took me by the arm one day as we were filing into assembly, and she was talking about the events that had happened in Brightlingsea and how amazing it would be to create a verbatim play out of it. We kind of did some interviews and things, but it went nowhere at the time. And 10 years on, I came across a call out for plays about Essex, and immediately this story kind of really sprung into my mind, and the reason was it is such an extraordinary story. Essentially what happened was in 1995, a small tiny little port in Essex called Brightlingsea decided to stage protests against live animal exports that were happening there. And live animal exports are basically animals being transported. Often you see them on lorries on motorways, and these animals were being transported with very little kind of food and water and care, to be shipped across out to Europe. And the town saw what was happening and felt that they had to do something about it. But this wasn't an ordinary kind of local opposition story. The townspeople really came together. They blockaded the town for 10 months. And these were not people that were seasoned activists. Lots of them had never protested before. Some people had never even voted. They were, mums with kids in buggies. They were elderly people. They were kids from the local school. So there was a real kind of cross-section of life in Brightlingsea who were there. And they faced police brutality. There were stories of people, an old lady chaining herself to a drain, and they really attracted a lot of media scrutiny. So it's just this really, really fantastic story about people becoming politicised. So when I saw this call out for plays about Essex, it was just the perfect story. So I texted Daisy and said, you really need to write this play, or can we do it together? Yes, please. And Daisy said, Daisy's now an amazing set designer. And she came back to me and said, super generously, you're the writer, you write it and I'll do the design for it. And she is doing the design for the play, which hopefully, fingers crossed, it was meant to happen last year. Hopefully it's going to happen this year in autumn 2021 at the Pleasance Theatre in Islington. And we've also, very excitingly, got some funding from Arts Council England to make a audio drama podcast of the play. So that's hopefully going to be coming out in spring, summer this year. So regardless of what happens with COVID, there will be some kind of offering, we hope, this year. So I've talked a little bit about the sort of background of the protests, but I think it's really hard to get kind of the sheer scale and scope and kind of extraordinary nature of these protests just from me. So what I thought I'd do just to start with, to give you a bit of a flavour, is show some clips, some actual footage of the protests before handing over to some of our speakers who were actually there to tell us a little bit more about their experiences. So I'm just going to share my screen and hope it all works. Here we go. So.
As we go marching and marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill-offs grey, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sanity discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses.
And so hopefully that should have given you a little bit more of a flavour of what happened in Brightlingsea.
Now to speak, we have some speakers who are actually there in Brightlingsea and witnessed what happened. I'm delighted to introduce you to our first panel of speakers, Juliette, Joyce and Maria. Juliette Maxam is currently Media and Public Relations Manager for Greater Anglia Train Company. She started her career in journalism working for the East Anglian Daily Times, Today newspaper and the Sunday Express. She was the first local newspaper journalist to report from Bosnia and met Nelson Mandela. She interviewed many celebrities, although one encounter led to Margaret Thatcher slamming a door in her face. Juliette played a central role in the protests in Brightlingsea, reporting on the events as they happened. Thank you so much for being here. Next, we have the fantastic Joyce D'Silva, who was Chief Executive of Compassion in World Farming for 14 years and is currently Ambassador Emeritus for them. Joyce played a key role in achieving the UK ban on sow stalls in the 90s and in getting recognition on animal sentience enshrined in the European Union treaties. Joyce has received an RSPCA award for very important contribution in the field of animal welfare. She has given evidence to the UK and New Zealand governments, the European Commission and the United Nations on issues ranging from genetic engineering and cloning of farm animals to meat reduction and regenerative agriculture. Thank you for joining us. And lastly, we have the fantastic Maria Wilby, who is currently a caseworker and director for Refugee Action, and has done extensive outreach work for the Refugee Council with families from Somalia and Iraq. In 2017, she was awarded Essex County Council's Volunteer of the Year Award. She was also a founding member of Brightlingsea Against Live Exports and helped organise the protest that happened. So that's our wonderful panel. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'd like to start by just asking you to speak a bit about what you were doing in 1995, who you were, what you were doing, and what led you to the protests. If we could start with Juliette, as you were reporting on the events.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for inviting me to take part in this. It's really thrilling, and it's been amazing looking back at those incredible 10 months in Brightlingsea. I was a young reporter on the East Anglian Daily Times. I'd only been there for 3 years. The year before, I'd been in Bosnia for a week with our local regiment. I was Clacton chief reporter, and Brightlingsea is in tendering, so it was my patch, therefore the story fell to me. Although there was so much of it, I did have the support of my colleagues. But for 10 months, I seemed to live down Brightlingsea, from early in the morning to late at night. It was really different times. I was trying to remember what we actually wrote our stories on. I had to put a message out to my fellow reporters. We had no internet, no Google, no email. I used a pager, and then I had to find a phone box to phone into the office. I'd call my copy over the phone. I'd file it over the phone, or else we used very, very basic word processor with a dial-up modem. So it was really different times. And it was the biggest story I'd ever done. The whole of the world's media was down in Brightlingsea.
It's incredible. Thank you. Joyce, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about your involvement with the protests or what you were doing in 95.
Well, I was the fairly new chief executive of Compassionate Farming. And obviously one of the organization's policies was to ban live animal exports. And just to perhaps do a little scene setting, at that time, in the early 90s, we were exporting nearly 2 million lambs and sheep and nearly 500,000 calves, many only a week old, to continental Europe. And the sheep were mostly going for slaughter. The calves, a lot of them were going to be reared in narrow veal crates, unable to turn around for the rest of their lives. And that was a system which we'd actually already got banned in the UK. So that added another dimension to the protest, because the calves were going to a system that would have been illegal in the UK. And what happened was that the ferry companies who had been taking the lorry loads of animals came under a lot of pressure, and they all withdrew from the trade and refused to have the trucks on the ferries. So the live exporters decided that they would hire their own boats, and Dover Harbour Board also forbid the trade. So the little boats had to go to other ports. So they went to ports like Shoreham near Brighton, and particularly to Brightlingsea. They also flew calves out of Coventry at Hull. But Brightlingsea became the kind of tinderbox place, I think, because it's kind of on almost a peninsula. So everyone who lived in Brightlingsea could see the trucks going through. And I've never known a town turn out in such numbers to protest against a trade that they felt was unfair and cruel. But I think Maria should tell the story.
Yeah, Maria, you were actually in Brightlingsea at the time. So if you want to speak to us a bit about...
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody, and thank you. This brings back sweet and sour memories, but mostly sweet, because Brightlingsea was remarkable. My mum got in touch with me and told me that there were going to be live animal exports, and I put my daughter in the buggy. She was age 3, and went around town putting up posters. I made 7 handwritten posters because, as you said, we didn't easily have internet and printers and things at our convenience in those days, and left my phone number on the posters. And when I got home, my phone message service was full, with people who'd already called back to say that they were interested in doing something about this. And one of the people who called back was another lady, Sue Wheeler, and she came to my house that afternoon, and we went along to a council meeting. Now, our little parish hall in Brightlingsea fits about 16 councillors and about 50 people in it, and there were 290 people at the meeting, so they had to put a speaker up outside the building to enable everybody to be able to hear what was happening. And then subsequently, all the council meetings about this issue were held in the community hall, which was able to facilitate a much larger number. I think the largest meeting was of about 1,000 people. So Brightlingsea were on it from the very, very start. People were absolutely outraged to think that this was going to be happening. And there is a history of activism in Brightlingsea. And Brightlingsea was very much against they supported the miners' strike when cheap imports of coal were coming through Brightlingsea. They did the reverse of what they did when the sheep were leaving the town. They were laying in the road to stop the imports of coal going into the UK. So it has a history of activism. And I think a lot of people in the town maybe had a memory of that. But yeah, there are remarkable people here, and they responded amazingly.
Yeah, because I think that was going to be one of my questions, is why do you think it did have such a big impact in Brightlingsea, and why do you think so many people were galvanized to join? Joyce, you kind of began to answer that when you were talking about it being, yeah.
I mean, I always think about Dover, because the trade had been going on at Dover, and there were always only protests organised by organisations like ours. And I think if you follow the motorway down to Dover, it doesn't go through the town at all. It goes around the side of the town straight into the port. So you could live in Dover and never see the truckloads of animals. But in Brightlingsea, you sort of couldn't avoid them, really. it's a sort of one road in kind of town. So everybody saw those trucks. So, you know, it was right on your doorstep. I think that may be why so many people got very motivated to support it. But that's just what I think.
I think that sounds reasonable. I don't know, Juliette, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I was looking for an interview that I did with Assistant Chief Constable Geoffrey Markham, who was the police officer in charge of the protests, who was, I'm sure Maria will agree, an incredibly arrogant man who I had many arguments with, and he absolutely hated the press and particularly hated the East Anglian. But a year afterwards, I was doing a piece about Brightlingsea 1 year on, and he said to me, they've got a local issue. They've been long opposed to the port, long opposed to the extension of trade in the port. They live in the town. It's comfortable and convenient to walk out on the streets. I think he was so wrong. He was so wrong. The people of Brightlingsea cared about the issue. They saw it going past their front doors and they wanted to do something about it. At the beginning of the protests, there were a lot of outsiders came into Brightlingsea, but the people of Brightlingsea stuck with it for 10 months. And they did put themselves out. They didn't just step out of their front doors. They went and protested in Colchester. I'm not sure, I think some of them went to Belgium, they went to Whitehall. They really put themselves out because they cared about the issue. And as Joyce said, it was going on in Shoreham, it was going on in Dover, it was going on in Coventry, Plymouth, and other places. And people were beginning to, you know, didn't want to think of animals as commodities to be traded like stocks and shares, because I personally think Richard Otley, one of the people involved, wasn't really a farmer, he was more a commodity dealer. And the people of Brightlingsea cared about it and they did something about it.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's a hilarious quote from the policeman, but also really sad as a way of kind of looking at the community that you are representing. Maria, I don't know if you had any further thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an astonishing quote. I think that's probably just, he was an elderly man, maybe that's how he likes to remember it. It wasn't his finest hour for sure, so maybe that's just his mind bending the facts, Trump style. Yeah, 695 people, I think, got arrested during the protests. Most of those people would have been alarmed if they'd had a parking ticket before this. Some of them had never left Brightlingsea. They had literally never turned left or right at the end of Thorrington, which is the road into Brightlingsea. So for them to get in trouble with the police was shocking, really shocking and alarming for them, and very, very worrying. We had people, lots of people in tears, worrying about having to go to court. So they did it because they meant it, and they did it because they cared.
Would you say that the Brightlingsea protests then had an impact on how the community had a relationship with the police?
Yes, it had an enormous impact. I mean, one decision the police made, which was very sensible, was not to involve our local police force. So although there were some police from Colchester, none of the Brightlingsea police force were involved, because it would have led to a really dreadful situation, I think. And when they brought in police from the Met, and particularly from Grays, who were the full support unit, people really felt affronted because they were dressed up in these heavy riot gear with shields and helmets. And obviously we were used to our Bobby on the beats, who would come and help you start your car and push you down the road and help you with your shopping and walk you back to your house. And this was a very different style of policing. And again, I think that just inflamed things and made people more determined than ever to carry on.
Yeah, when you see the footage from that, it's really shocking, and to see kind of how violent the police were in response to the protests. My next question is slightly trickier because it's about...
Oh, actually, sorry, can I come in there? Sorry, because I'm really bursting to say this.
Go on.
Geoffrey Markham, oh my God, it's just been amazing looking back at the interview I did with him and some of the footage. He and the police, and in fact the PCA, blamed the violence on the media, which is astonishing considering the heavy-handed tactics that they used in the first week. And then he blamed, so he blamed the breakdown in relations breakdowns in relationships between the town and the police on the media. And yet on one of the first few weeks of protests, I interviewed Maria, and on the same day as I interviewed Maria, where she was really gracious and came across really like a really kind, thoughtful person, he basically said he found calls for his resignation outrageous and said, "I do not sleep over operations like this. This is my job." And I looked back at a lot of the cuttings and thinking about it from the perspective now as a press officer myself, or a media relations manager. And I thought, yeah, if I'd been an Essex Police press officer, I would not have been happy with the East Anglian Daily Times. But more to the point, I wouldn't have been happy with what Geoffrey Markham was saying. Bear in mind, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't social media. People relied on the paper to get their news. So our reports were being read, and he gave us just the choicest quotes, which showed him for being as arrogant as he was. So yes, he blamed the press. I'm putting it back there now that I can. It's his fault that the relationship broke down.
I mean, that is a very Trumpian tactic, isn't it? The media are to blame.
Oh yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. He was a precursor to Donald Trump. Never thought of him like that.
I mean, I guess that leads to another question, which is, which I'd like to ask Joyce to start, is what differences do you see between, and you've kind of between all of you begun to outline them now, but between activism then and activism now?
Well, I mean, as I think we all know now, activism is at the touch of a button on a phone or a screen or something, and there was absolutely none of that. It was phone calls and hard copy letters and that kind of thing in those days, and phone trees where one person would ring another person to let them know the protest is at 6 o'clock tomorrow. So it was just completely different. You couldn't suddenly get in touch with 200 people. You had to do bit by bit. So I think that, in spite of that, handicap, if you like, the protest still drew the hundreds of people in this, pretty small town, really. So I think that was a big difference. But the idea of going on the streets, that still holds good. And as we see from the climate protests, Black Lives Matter protests, people are still prepared to go on the streets for something they believe in. And that happened then, and that still happens now. There's something about that strength of numbers, and especially protest, if you can keep it peaceful, which we always tried to do, and I know Maria did too. It's quite powerful, I think. I think when people see the pictures, it really moves them. And I mean, just a personal anecdote, about 2 weeks before the protest began, before we knew that votes were going to go out from Brightlingsea, I was talking to Maria, and I'd been on some television program, Country File or something, and she said, "Mum, I don't know how you do television." And I said, "Well, it's scary, but," and she said, "I could never do television." And of course, within about 2 months, every time I got home from work and put on the 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock news, there was Maria talking about the protest in Brightlingsea and doing it, as Juliette said, in a very sort of calm, measured way.
Yeah, that's a lovely anecdote. I think you're right that it is just a totally different landscape. One of the questions that I wanted to move us on to or raise was that I know that in the research period, one of the things that Polly found quite shocking was learning about, and this is actually then a feature of the play, is one of the protesters who died as part of the protest, and it was later found out that he had been a significant member of the National Front in the 1970s. And I was wondering if any of you would be able to speak a bit about how that was whether or not that was a reflection of relations around, whether or not that was a reflection of attitudes towards race in Brightlingsea in the 90s, and whether that was also a reflection of attitudes towards race more generally in the 90s. Maria.
I'd like to answer that one. So firstly, Derek Day, the gentleman we're talking about, was actually from Jaywick down the road. And at the time, Jaywick was the highest density of National Front members in the UK. So if you lived there, pretty certain that you were at least a sympathiser. Obviously not very pleasant if you're not a sympathiser and you were living there at the time. Apologies if that applies to anybody who's listening. But Derek and his wife, and actually some of his children, came on the protest regularly, and he became one of the, a leader would be a wrong word to say, but he became somebody that people looked for because he was very outspoken, and he was a good speaker. It was only afterwards that I found out about his National Front associations, which would have been a problem for me if I had found out before, because I'm half Indian, so I would have found it very, very difficult to get on with him. We actually were both taken, amongst a group of 14 of us, we were both taken to the High Court, so we spent a lot of time together when we were at court together, and we had to prepare papers together. And I did get to know him very well, and I was actually the person who, when he died, had to sit with his wife and hear that news. So it's quite an unusual situation. I would just also like to make a comment about the fact that we tried very hard to keep things peaceful, and that was very largely because of the influence and almost the tuition and guidance of a gentleman called Andy Abbott, who came down and had studied, really worked at non-violent direct action and gave us the principles of it. And although it was something that felt very natural to a lot of us, he really did try very hard to show us how to keep a protest active and engaged for a period of 10 months. That's quite a job, by helping us to mark certain days, to have certain types of protests. We had a funeral march, lots of things. And I do remember him having a talk with Derek one day, and Derek was saying, we should light barrels half filled with oil and roll them down Cone Road. And he was pointing out to Derek that that's not a good idea. It's a residential street, and there are lots of people who live there and children who come on the protest, and also wouldn't the oil and the fire be dangerous for the sheep? And, you know, obviously, you know, those kind of things got wiped out because the overwhelming majority of people on the protest were there to peacefully protest. But there were obviously other people there, and we tried to bring them with us, and that is largely what happened. You know, Derek did follow the rest of us and protest peacefully while he was there, although he maintained his personal views.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Maria, and for answering that. I think it's very interesting when politics, I think that's a really interesting thing around protesting, and particularly eco-activism, that it does somehow often contradict or is at odds with other people's personal politics. And I think that's interesting today as well. As a final question to the three of you, did the protests have any impact on you personally? And if so, how? If we could start with Joyce.
Well, because, you know, Compassionate Farming's office was in Hampshire, you know, I wasn't on the spot. I was there occasionally, and obviously I was getting almost daily reports from Maria or from BBC 6 o'clock news. So I think, you know, the whole organisation of Compassionate Farming was terribly tied up. I mean, at one time, myself and 3 other colleagues were on the phone doing interviews with different radio stations at the same time, all about the protests. And, you know, I don't think that situation has ever arisen again, you know, and we were all doing our own TV interviews as well as radio, and of course newspapers too. So, I mean, the whole protest had a huge effect on the organisation because it became the story of the year. But we weren't there on the street all the time. We took it in turns. Some of us went down to Brightlingsea, but Maria's the person who was there 24 hours a day. Yeah.
So Maria, if I hand the question over to you.
It changed Brightlingsea for sure. So we have 2 large co-op stores in town, and they never had so much demand for vegetarian food as they did that year, and that continued and still holds. They have a large proportion of vegetarian meals sold at our locals than there are in other parts of Essex. So a lot of people changed their eating habits, and a lot of people are now much more politically aware as a result of what happened. I mean, the Public Order Act was something that was brought in a few months into the protest, and the police basically tried to stop people being organisers. So we were told if we were deemed to be an organiser, we could be put in prison, which obviously, if you have a 3-year-old daughter, is quite scary. It didn't stop most people, but it did halt them in their steps for a few weeks. And then things just, it got them angry again, and they came back out on the streets. But I think most people now second guess news stories when they hear them. I think they don't trust what they're told by politicians so much. I don't think any of us do anymore, but certainly back in those days, most of those people would have listened to what local politicians were saying. And I think that has changed profoundly for people in Brightlingsea.
Thank you. And finally, Juliette.
Well, as I said earlier, I was immersed in it for 10 months. There was no other story quite like it. And I was looking through some of the pieces I wrote at the time, and the variety of emotions that I went through as well. I spoke of being scared, frightened, on the verge of tears, but also I was a reporter. It was exciting and it was exhilarating because it was such a big story. It certainly developed me as a journalist. It got me shifts on national newspapers. And I really wanted to move to Brightlingsea afterwards because I just loved the community. I really, really enjoyed the time there because, well, Maria was incredible. It was an amazing campaign. I mean, the twists and turns, the PR things that they came up with, like, you know, Billy Bragg going down there, Carla Lane, Tony Banks. It was an incredible time. So at the time, yes, it did change me quite considerably.
Thank you all so much for speaking. I'm going to do a kind of Zoom clap. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you all. We're now going to show a short filmed clip of an extract of the play, and that was directed by myself and stars Marsha Leckie and Francesca Isherwood, and is obviously written by the wonderful Polly, who is there on my screen but might not be there on yours. But she is. Fantastic. And it was filmed by the brilliant Samira Odenberg, but it is worth noting that due to filming right now and social distancing measures and all the extra stuff, the sound is questionable. So hopefully, touch wood, you can all hear it properly. But yeah, enjoy.
God, I needed this.
Sorry, the coffee's crap. Just coming for the view, really.
It's gorgeous.
I used to come here with mine when they were little.
How many do you have?
2 boys, Jamie and Michael. Not so little anymore, though. Jamie's at uni studying psychology and Michael's doing his A-levels.
It must be nice now they're a bit older. You get to know them as real people. Yeah. Doesn't make it any easier, though. Jamie's fine. He's always been fine, never had to worry. Michael, though, so sort of closed up. Doesn't tell me anything. Really?
I think he's having problems making friends at college. I'm worried he might be being bullied. He won't tell me anything.
But I'm sure, though, he would come to you if it was something really bad.
I hope so.
Beverly, my mother here, she means very well, but she keeps giving me all this advice every time Danny starts crying. Have you tried swaying her back and forth quickly like the midwife said? Maybe she's allergic to your milk. My friend Kathy's daughter had a problem with that. Rare. I know she's tired too. The crying's keeping her up as well. It wasn't like this with Lewis. He cried, yeah, but could always get him down for a few hours, get some sleep in. Danny, she's so... It's awful. The GP reckons it's colic. But even now in the supermarket, Danny's back at home with Bev and it's like I can still hear her crying. It's like ringing in your ears.
Don't worry, I've been there. I really have.
And the thing is, I know that Bev and Roger, they think it's me. I'm doing something wrong. You see it with strangers as well when you're out. People looking at you, old women frowning. When I was out with Lewis, they would coo and cluck over him, give me these little smiles. Sorry, I really shouldn't be saying all this. Honestly, I love being a mum, and Bev and Roger, they've been so kind. I'm just so tired, that's all. Sorry, I'm a mess. Forgetting my purse, buying bags and bags of Angel of Delight.
Don't be silly. It's completely fine.
It's just such a relief to talk about it. My family's all back in Chelmsford. It's really hard to meet anyone here, actually. I mean, you see people at playgroup and you get to know the odd face in the street. You can't really go up to people and just start talking.
Hey, you should come to us.
Say no to live animal exports. What's that, like animal rights or something?
Yeah. It's about these lorries. They're trying to start to use Brightlingsea as a major port, taking live cattle and sheep to be slaughtered over in Belgium. The thing is, they transport them in these lorries without any water or food, and they're on them for hours.
Oh yeah, I've seen them coming through actually. I'm not squeamish or anything. My family's from country people. I used to go beating for shoots when I was a kid just to get some extra cash. But you can see it's not right. Oh, they're so squished in and that. Their face is all pressed together.
My friend Marie is organising a meeting at Thursday at the community centre. You won't need to speak. You should come.
That sounds great. I don't know if I'll be able to make it. It depends if I can get Bev and Roger to watch the kids. I'd love to if I can though.
Bring the kids if you need to. Nobody will mind a bit of crying. There'll be loads of people there. We're trying to get a campaign together. Petitions, talking to MPs, that sort of thing.
Okay. I'll definitely be there if I can. And if not, you'll have to give me your address and I'll pop round with the money I owe you on Friday.
No, really, no rush. Really.
Thank you for everything. I better go now. I've got to get back to Danny's next feed.
It's lovely to meet you.
Hopefully see you on Thursday.
Yeah, Thursday.
Thank you again to everyone who's involved with that, particularly Imi for directing it. Really, it was quite a feat in the midst of, just before we went into lockdown, we filmed that. So yeah, really exciting to kind of see it brought to life. We're now going to move on to the second part of our sort of panel discussions, in which we're going to be thinking, we've kind of looked backwards at what happened in Brightlingsea in 1995, but thinking about how that connects with the future of the discussion around agriculture, sustainability, and also diversity and racism within the environmental movement. So I'm really delighted. I'm just going to pop them on the screen. I'm really excited to introduce my next two speakers, as well as the other panelists we've had before. So we've got Anita Okunde, and Anita Okunde is only 17 years old, but already she's accomplished more than most of us. She's a real tide turner and a change maker. Anita's a climate activist and has been a key figure in the youth strike movement. She's also president and founder of the Girl Up Manchester organisation, which works with the United Nations to celebrate and empower young women. She's also a former member of the Youth Parliament and is CEO and founder of sustainable and ethical cosmetics brand Senega. So lovely to have you here tonight, Anita. And then alongside her, we've also got Helen Browning, OBE. And Helen is a mixed organic farmer, and she as well is a real kind of visionary. In a male-dominated field, Helen has trailblazed organic farming in the UK. She's been chief executive of the Soil Association since 2011, and amongst her many roles advising government and kind of advocating for change, she is a member of the Food Ethics Committee, trustee of the RSPB, commissioner for the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, and has sat on the BBC Rural Affairs Advisory Committee and the National Food Strategy Advisory Board. And also very pertinent to this discussion, she's also chaired the England Animal Health and Welfare Implementation Group. And she's also one of my favourite Desert Island Disc castaways. So it's really lovely to have you all here this evening. And I suppose what would be great to hear, maybe particularly from Anita and Helen, is just kind of what makes you do what you do, what has brought you to activism, and kind of the roles you're doing now. So maybe starting with you, Helen.
Thanks a lot, Polly. It's lovely to be here. Really great to see that film. So my story is quite straightforward in some ways. I grew up on the farm that I now run. I was a farmer's daughter, and I was lucky enough to have the chance to go farming. But I started to recognize, even in my teens, that the wildlife was disappearing on the farm. As the hedges were being ripped out, everything was changing. And then when I did my degree in agricultural technology, I was taken to the first time to see these kind of state-of-the-art, supposedly, pig and poultry and dairy units, which, I'm not particularly squeamish either, but I was really horrified by the way we were farming our animals. And so I really wanted to try and farm in a different way. And so when I had the chance to take over the farm, I started to explore organic and keeping our animals in really much more natural conditions. And that became my life's kind of campaign in a way to go down that route. So it was largely the animal welfare side of the thing, as well as sort of wildlife and health, that kind of drove me down this road.
That's really brilliant. And how about you, Anita? How did you kind of become involved in your activism?
It's kind of like a weird type of story. So I was always like, and I think I started activism when I was like 11, so year 7, but it wasn't predominantly like sustainability in the environment. It was more looking at like racism and gender equality. But then when I started getting more involved in like the climate movement, I realized how all those things were linked so much, and it was weird to talk about race or gender equality without talking about the impact on the climate and how it affects those people in the climate crisis. So that's when I started campaigning more largely around climate activism and sustainability, and obviously how class, race, gender has to play in that. And I got to do some amazing work with a lot of different companies and organizations talking about that. And that's pretty much how it started.
That's really fascinating. It's and how do you think we could join? It's a really big question, but how do you think we could maybe join up those conversations more? So particularly thinking about feminism and sort of anti-racism, how can we join that up with the climate movement and really kind of bring the discussion together a bit more?
I think it's important when discussing things like gender and race, etc., to always try to like kind of subtly put the environment in there. That's how I kind of started, because a lot of my friends were like really passionate about gender equality and racism, but when it came to the environment, they were kind of like, it's not a big deal. And it's like, but it's just as big of a deal. So I thought that's how I kind of first started it, and like kind of putting like, you care about this, but did you know that the environment is also a big factor in this? And also when talking in the environmental movement, which tends to be a very white dominated movement, and it's kind of difficult sometimes to get your point across, but making sure and looking at other Black activists, other ethnic minority activists was super cool, and women as well. It was really cool to actually meet them and like see people who have like-minded views alongside you, and making sure that they also got to speak and had their voice heard was really important.
Yeah, and that's something, Maria, I guess because Maria, you now work sort of with refugees. Is that something that you feel is kind of becoming, is that conversation happening more in terms of linking up sort of climate justice and people thinking about sort of racial justice and sort of global politics? Do you think that's kind of coming into the conversation, or do we, obviously we need to push it more, but is it there?
Yeah, I think all of those things are about empowering people to have their voices. Every campaign I've ever been involved in is about people finding their voices to say what they believe is wrong, and to know that it is wrong and that they have rights. So a large part of the work that we do is about empowering our clients. So I deal more with asylum seekers and refugees and vulnerable migrants as well. And for a lot of those people, they don't know their rights. Once they know their rights, then they're often very capable of finding them for themselves. So I think it's about making people feel empowered. And to do that, very often you have to have somebody who guides them in the first instance. And I think that's the same for any campaign. I think with things like racism and driving it out of other campaigns, we live in a country with a hostile environment policy, and it's very difficult to do that. And things like Windrush show you very well that is still very alive. And it takes people like Anita to start from the ground up and engage people at a young age, so that is not still happening in 20 years' time.
Absolutely. And it does feel, I think it really does feel like maybe just starting these conversations are finally starting to come together a little bit more, but still obviously have a long way to go. And Helen, I wanted to ask you how you think, do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement is starting to shape conversations about sort of sustainability and farming? Is that coming in at all, or is it still kind of a long way off? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think that actually the farming and in the environment, the environment movement haven't been great at embracing diversity. I just think that, and it was really interesting to hear what Anita had to say about that in terms of having, what's the starting point for that conversation? Because I think, it's not a gender issue. There's loads of women involved in the environment, and some involved in farming now as well. But I think it's really challenging to make sure that people who come from different ethnic backgrounds feel that this is something that is for them, and to find a way in. And I think we've got to do far more to engage people much earlier in their careers, or even in, at school, to say the environment is for all of us, and to try and find ways into careers and activism, because it is still not happening, and we all recognize that. I think there's been a real awakening, not just in the last year, actually. I think over the last 10 years that we haven't done enough to bring a more diverse community in.
That's a really kind of great thing, to that kind of dual approach of sort of education and grassroots stuff, but also thinking about it in a more kind of structural way as well. I think that's a really kind of interesting way of looking at it. I suppose this is a question sort of I'd like to open up to everyone. But what do you think, kind of from all your different, you're kind of coming at this from lots of different approaches. So Juliette and Joyce, Maria, from your experiences, both kind of with Brightlingsea and environmental activism, and then Helen and Anita with your kind of specialisms. What do you think is not maybe getting the kind of, live animal exports was something that kind of rose to the surface in Brightlingsea. Are there any other issues, such as that, or, linked to that you would like to see kind of more on the agenda that we should be talking about that we aren't talking about in terms of agriculture, food, sustainability, but also, race and gender as well? It's a really big question, but yeah, I'll just sort of open that up to everyone.
Well, I mean, I think it's true that among the leaders of the environment and animal movement in the UK, it's predominantly white, which is a shame. But, if you look to different African countries, India and China, they've all got their own movements led by people living in those countries. So it shouldn't be a whites only kind of movement. And, I hope that in 10 years' time, we wouldn't even need to have this conversation because it will have changed. And I don't know if it's just that it's a colour thing or if it's to do with a kind of middle class thing, or because some of the issues like live animal exports, it was easy for people to say, oh, we're sending our poor little calves away to have nasty foreigners do something to them. And that did kind of rear its head a little bit. I mean, certainly in Compassion World Farming, we're very aware of these issues and doing what we can. But it's a tricky one. I can't remember the second half of your question, sorry.
I was asking if there's also just anything in terms of maybe kind of in terms of animal welfare or something that you think is being currently overlooked that you would like to see being brought to the forefront of the discussion. So I don't know, maybe, as Helen, I know that was something that with, maybe it's soil erosion, or maybe it's that would be.
There are so many things, I think, at the moment. But I think one of the themes that the Soil Association is doing quite a lot of work on, if we're sticking on the animal theme, is the way we feed the animals that feed us. So obviously we want to get rid of all industrial livestock farming. I think Joyce and I and most people on this call would want to stop the kind of inhumanity that still goes on actually in the most intensive animal farming. We'd want to stop that for all sorts of reasons, not least the welfare side. But I think that there's a whole hidden cost to that too, which is the way we use so much of the food that's grown around the world, and often we're importing that from places which are being deforested to grow soya and palm oil, which is actually for us, not the animals. So I think those issues of how much of the world's resources should we individually be consuming? We all have whatever it is, maybe an acre of land that needs to look after us, and we need to have a much greater sense of how we can reduce our own footprint and how we stop doing damage elsewhere through the choices we make about the foods that we eat, and we stop being cruel. And all those things actually join up together. But we're going at it through the feeding the animals angle, because that's one that at the moment doesn't get the spotlight it needs to have.
I'd say one of the things that worries me that I think was mentioned at the end of last year is the implications of Brexit on animal welfare standards and on the standards of the food that we eat. We've all heard a lot about chlorination of chicken. I don't know much about it, but that's something that worries me, and I wonder if that will come to the forefront from activists who, make it known. I mean, you've got people like Hugh Fearnley-Whittinstall and Jamie Oliver who campaign about these matters, but even they seem to have gone a little bit quiet recently.
Well, I mean, I think chlorinated chicken is kind of a welfare at second degree, because the reason they put chlorine on the chicken carcasses is because the chickens are reared in such foul conditions in factory farms. And I have to say, the American factory farms are perhaps not that different from the chicken factory farms here, but we don't use chlorine. So it's a bit tricky. Is there an upside to Brexit for animal welfare? Possibly on the one issue that we were talking about this evening. There is now a government consultation in England and Wales about banning live animal exports. Now, exports have gone down hugely since the days of the protests. The figures are in tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands and millions. But the government is carrying out a consultation, and the minister, George Eustace, just before Christmas, actually said the live animal export trade was cruel and unnecessary. And I thought, wow, the minister saying that. We've been saying that for 40 years. So I think they might get banned, which would be a huge victory for everyone who's been involved, including definitely the Brightlingsea folk, if that happens, which would be terrific. So that could be an upside of Brexit. But the fact that a lot of the advances that have happened in the last few years have been at EU level. And so far, we're waiting for the government to acknowledge those things in UK law, like recognizing animals as sentient beings, which they say they will do. And Compassion led the campaign to have them recognized in the European Treaty, but now we're no longer part of Europe. So you could say technically at this moment in time, the UK government does not recognize that animals are sentient beings and can feel joy, pain, fear, suffering, etc.
It's really interesting that you bring up Brexit, because I think that was one of the things I found really interesting in researching this play. Because I think when I set out to write it, I thought it was this amazing story that was really kind of evident from just watching footage, and particularly I think I was really drawn to the fact that, you know, it was a lot of women who were involved with it who were really running it, and kind of from, you know, a range of different backgrounds. But then as I dug deep, it was really interesting that everyone sort of had their opinion on the motivation of protesters. And my kind of feeling researching was that most people were there because they really cared about the animals and they could see it happening and it was on their doorstep and they could do something. But it was also interesting kind of within that to see how the conversation in some ways got hijacked. So for example, Bernard Jenkins, the MP who was involved with it, and he's a big Brexiteer, and there was this sort of narrative of the animals being shipped over to Belgium, and even what you were saying about, oh, there's this idea of like it's other people doing stuff to animals, it's not here. But then again, that's another complicated argument, because, you know, for sustainability and things, we should be supporting British farms, and then there were kind of just loads of different rabbit holes. And then also that this whole thing opened up when I discovered the story about Derek Day and his involvement in the National Front. And there was this kind of amazing hypocrisy in the fact that he was there protesting against people being inhumane to animals. And I'd seen footage of him in a Johnny Rotten documentary hurling abuse at a black woman and her child as they walked down the street in the East End of London in the 70s. So it's just this story that had so much kind of knottiness to it. And at its core, it was a story about, you know, a community coming together and people really fighting for what they believed in. But actually within that, there were kind of all these power dynamics and struggles, and which I think is true of every activist movement to some extent. But I think it was really interesting to explore that. And yeah, just quick, we're going to go to questions in a second, but I just wanted to ask you, Anita, if you think that the kind of move to online activism, and sort of particularly as the climate strikers movement has really moved online with COVID, do you think that those kind of dynamics and sort of the knottiness of activism, do you think we lose some of that by being online? Because in a way those conversations are more, I don't know, people can retweet something and it becomes a little bit more transparent and everyone sort of has a platform, or do you think that it's more kind of infighting? What do you think?
This is like a really big question, especially in the climate activism movement in general. I think having online activism definitely gives a way to more accessibility for people who may not be able to attend strikes, who can't leave school, and who can't actually attend the climate strike that we hold. And I think that's an important aspect, because a lot of young people would love to join but can't do it in that physical stand way. And having online digital actions they can do in the climate strikes online are super cool. You get to meet a load of young people from across the globe who are all fighting for the same thing. And we've seen loads of results from online activism. So we've been able to speak with important figures and we've actually seen decisions being changed. So it works. On the other hand, online activism opens up this whole new term we've created called cloutivism, where the activism isn't done from the heart. It's done like exactly like retweeting a tweet or posting something, but their actions and their motivations for it are quite otherwise. And I mean, the arguments can go both ways. In one way, even though their intentions may not be pure, what they're posting is still helping the environmental movement, yes. But on the other side, they don't actually have the intention to help, and it's more to actually kind of gain the clout or become more popular because of their activism. And that's where we see platforms being given to the wrong type of people. They don't know much about the movement, and they don't actually gain the knowledge or actually do the research and do that work that activists do, but they're retweeting and posting, and it makes them seem the exact same. So I think it has definitely opened up a load of opportunities and has allowed it to grow a lot more and have a lot more supporters for the climate activism movement. But at the same time, it does get naughty, really naughty. So I think it's important to maintain that balance.
But yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, and summing up that sort of duality that you have online, a blessing and a curse. I'd like to open up the floor now to any questions. So if anyone's got a question, you can either do it by if you there's a raise your hand and the reactions option, or you could also write Q or question in the chat, and we'll do our best to kind of come to everyone's questions as we go through. So I see we've got a question from Izzy Inkpen. So hand over to Izzy.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for this amazing event, and Polly, congratulations on the release of your play and everything. I hope to read it or listen to it or see it one day. This is a question, possibly Maria will have some particular ideas on this, but obviously anyone can chip in. I was thinking about how animal rights and the treatment of animals is often considered a sort of almost a litmus paper for oppression, in terms of how we treat animals is how we treat the other, and how we treat difference, and all of this kind of idea. And so then I was thinking, it was when you said about how the hostile environment in the UK, sort of the relationship between how opinions have shifted or arguably not shifted, given that live exports are still happening in the UK, and how that might relate to refugee policy or that kind of relation. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I can certainly talk around that. Yeah, it's very interesting because actually, as we've been talking, I've been thinking about the fact that there are a whole group of asylum seekers who are now being housed in barracks, and they're old-fashioned concrete barracks with concrete floors, beds that are bunks that are so close together that they can't sit up on the top bunk because their heads will hit the ceiling, no heating, inadequate washing facilities. And I'm thinking about the similarity to those trucks of animals. And actually the thing that links all of those things is greed and money, which I think is still a driving force for a lot of the evils in the world. And I guess capitalism, and the fact that an awful lot of people listen to adverts that tell you you're worth it and tell you that you deserve things, and forget about the cost of things. So that could be an environmental cost. It could be a cost that uses slave labor in another country. And there is a link to everything that we've been talking about environmentally, and the profits that are made and where those profits go. And sadly, the people who profit normally are the people in power. So yeah, there are enormous links, and I guess it's just for all of us to decide for ourselves that we don't want to be part of that link, and we don't want to be part of that movement of being greedy, and to make decisions for ourselves which, as Helen said, lower our impact and our footprint on this earth in all sorts of ways, not just environmentally, but in terms of cruelty and in terms of causing oppression. So I don't know if that answers anything. I hope so.
Does anyone else want to come in on that? I think it's quite an interesting question. So if anyone else has any thoughts.
Well, I mean, I just think it is this fundamental weakness that humans seem to have of seeing other people or other sentient beings or whatever as other instead of another. You know, we see them as the other instead of another like us. So Maria touched on that, and I think it is kind of fundamental to how we deal with other people in the world and how we deal with animals too.
Yeah, I think it's really something that, I mean, I've been, you know, vegetarian or vegan to differing amounts kind of most of my life, and I've been part of the sort of discussion around animal rights, but I think it was really interesting doing the research around this, about the stickiness of language that's used around animal rights sometimes, and parallels that are drawn between kind of different social justice movements, and some of the language that animal rights activists use, I found at times quite challenging, and have had some quite challenging conversations around that. Yeah, I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, because that's something that I've really struggled with, because I can understand it, and almost when you can see, like Izzy was saying about it being kind of a litmus test, there are themes of kind of cruelty and things, but also it being inappropriate to use certain language.
Sorry, if I come in there, I remember one of the things I really remember from being down in Brightlingsea was all the videos. I don't know if you remember them, Maria. Everyone would say, have you seen this video? And it was the most awfully distressing, shocking footage of animal cruelty. And I think that's a little bit of what you're talking about, Polly, about the language that is used. And I think there are similarities with activism today. You know, in environment, you know, you see these shocking footage of, you know, huge swathes of the Amazon razed to the ground. But I guess shock tactics are what works, and that's what changes people's emotions and gets them involved. But I found it personally really distressing, that aspect of it, when I was in Brightlingsea. I did resist watching the videos, I'm afraid to say.
And I think that shock tactics don't always work. I think they can get somebody interested, but I think the stories and the humanity of the stories is what keeps people interested. So for instance, in the work that I do now, a large part of it is about telling people stories, obviously with their permission, in detail and with humanity and with perspective, because once people truly make that connection with somebody, then they can't forget that. And the next time that they're passing somebody who's from another country, they'll wonder about what their story is and why they might be here, and they might be a little kinder. So I think there's a place for the shock tactics, but I think there's a greater place for the stories, because I think we all listen to stories, we're interested in them, and before you know it, they've gone into your heart.
Yeah, I agree. And you know, I always think, I've been on Helen Browning's farm and seen how well her pigs are cared for. But I've also seen pigs in factory farms. And, you know, it's just so completely different. It's a completely other story in terms of animal welfare. And also the wider issues of organic farming, you know, avoiding soya from Brazil and Paraguay and Argentina and so on. So compassionate farming believes that if we're going to tackle climate, animal cruelty, etc., and biodiversity loss, that we will all have to eat fewer animal products, less meat, less milk, less eggs. But that means that we can do all that, get rid of all the factory farms, and you would only have animals really on the kind of farm that people like Helen organize, decent farms where the animals are treated properly. So big message, eat less meat, and only high welfare stuff. I think Helen would probably agree, I hope.
Completely agree. And I think that there's, you know, that this conversation about the sort of compassion, that kind of sense of interconnectedness we have to have, that I think helps take away both the fear and the that sense of other that you talked about earlier on, Joyce, I think is so important. You know, how do we get people to get out of their own little bubbles and to have the opportunity to connect with a wider world, both a natural world and a social world and an animal world that stops it feeling like that is alien, that is not me, that is not what I need to be care about or be part of, and to have the opportunity to care. You know, there's a whole theme that I think has been really well explored in this conversation about how that compassion runs through everything we do, or it needs to run through that so much more.
Fantastic. And then I've got a question. George Gibson has asked, they said this is from Maria, but I will open up to everyone as well. How do you think the play Humane can help the current activism movement while it talks about the past?
Oh, okay, I'll give first bash, but I'm sure other people can talk about this. I do think it's important to remember the past. I think that's become very important during the recent protests about race and the recent protests against Trump and all sorts of things. It's important to remember the past. It's important to remember our history, because otherwise everything we do seems to just be an immediate knockback from what has immediately come before that. It's really important to get perspective on things. And if you can demonstrate that 10 months of continuous protest can actually stop something in one place, then that means that 10 months of continuous protest might stop that happening from another place. And eventually people run out of venues in which to practice their horrible practices. And we don't become, we become united across a country, across the world. And everybody realizes that doing their own bit can join up into something much grander.
Yeah, to follow on with that, I mean, we're all facing this climate emergency, and you know, governments set their own targets for zero carbon emissions by 2050 or whatever, but you can't just have one country doing that, or 6 or 20. Everyone is involved in this, so it's a whole pan-global movement. It has to be, or it simply won't work. And obviously from the sort of food and farming aspect, you know, livestock rearing produces 14.5% of the global greenhouse gases that are associated with human activity. It's about the same as transport, slightly more. So, you know, there's been quite a lot of really good research from Oxford University and so on, showing the impact on global warming of diet. And there's no doubt that the fewer animal products you eat, the smaller your impact. But again, there are kind of subtleties in there to do with organic farming and the food and feed and use of pesticides and so on in traditional industrial farming. So everything is linked up. It really is.
I thought the recent climate emergency protests, there were some in Colchester, so just up the road from Colchester, from Brightlingsea, really reminded me of Bale and of the protest down in Brightlingsea. It was a similar cross-section of people, young and old, children. Peaceful protest. I remember they just all lay down in front of Colchester Town Hall when the council were being asked to declare a climate emergency. And I think what the play shows by reminding people of Brightlingsea is the power of peaceful protest, a protest that brings people together, united in an issue rather than politics.
Thank you.
We might need a bit more of that protest again.
Yeah.
I
Come
think.
on, Maria.
Yeah, and then I can see we've got a question from Ruby Portis. So I don't know if Ruby, you want to ask your question.
Hello. Yeah, I was going to write it and I couldn't concentrate on listening and writing at the same time. It was a question for all of you, but Anita sparked it for me when you were talking about how the climate activist movement is very white-led and white-dominated, and I particularly wondered if you had any thoughts about Extinction Rebellion, because they, I mean, it's quite an obvious question, but they've got a lot of tactics that have been called out as quite, like, you know, not accessible to lots of different classes and genders and races. Like, for example, the tactic of just mass arresting as a way to get attention. So yeah, I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you for that question. Interestingly enough, I literally just wrote a paper on this, and Extinction Rebellion and their ways. So I have quite a lot to say about this one. I think Extinction Rebellion as a whole, as what they stand for, is amazing. Their actual tactics, however, are problematic, especially for the Black, Indigenous, people of color community. The whole mass arresting and the aim to be arrested is dangerous for when it comes to actual Black people and people of color. And I don't think Extinction Rebellion actually take that into account when they're actually going about and planning their protests. This is shown by the lack of Black leadership in Extinction Rebellion, because they don't take these things into account, especially when leading protests, the actual organization, and people who manage things like their PR, etc. They don't tend to actually own any accountability when it comes to their protesting. And sometimes it can get a lot reckless, very reckless and very violent. And it goes to the extreme side of activism that doesn't make people safe. And I think that's really important, the safety of people, especially Black people and people of color, because without that safety, they don't feel like they're able to go and protest, and they don't feel like they're actually welcomed in that space. And I think if we're wanting a more inclusive and a more diverse climate activism platform, you need to make sure that everyone's safe and everyone feels included. And spaces like Extinction Rebellion, although their causes are amazing and they're great, they don't actually allow Black people and people of color to feel safe in those spaces when their main goal is to get arrested and the arrestables. And they kind of demonize not getting arrested and like not being for the cause. And I think that's unfair, not only to Black people, but even people in general who don't want to actually have to be out there and be arrested. It doesn't necessarily have to be Black people or people of color, although there are a lot more threats and it's a lot more dangerous for them. People in general, some people just don't want to do that. And making sure that you actually have a space that allows people to share their voice and actually be involved in the campaigning, be involved in having a say without being arrested is really important for the inclusion and diversity in the climate movement, because it allows more accessibility, which I think right now Extinction Rebellion needs to work on and make sure they kind of move on from that.
That's brilliant. And it's really interesting. I was just wondering, because I was thinking earlier about the conversation about police brutality and Brightlingsea and sort of the arrests and things like that. Maria, Juliette and Joyce, do you think, obviously you were talking about people, that idea of the Bobby and the Beat being sort of overturned in a way, and do you think that there was a long-lasting change? Obviously it's a very white community in Brightlingsea, but do you think it opened up people's eyes to kind of problems of police brutality and things in a way that they'd been able to kind of ignore before because it wasn't affecting them as directly?
I think they couldn't believe it when it happened, I don't think. That first week and those really terrible protests where the police waded in riot gear and just completely mishandled the situation really shocked the people of Brightlingsea, because they had been a very law-abiding community. And then I think they just couldn't believe that the police actually did act in that way. They'd seen it on the television, but not on their own streets. Whether it changed people's attitudes, I think it changed people's attitudes towards the police. But I mean, Maria, you were arrested several times, weren't you? As were plenty of other people. I mean, there was 598 arrests. I don't know how that went down really in terms of affecting everybody's futures.
So I'm in touch with quite a few people who grew up during that time, and a lot of them are activists now. They grew up seeing that, witnessing that, and felt empowered by the fact that some of their friends and family were arrested and that nothing too dire did happen to them. Again, obviously taking into account what Anita said, they were largely from white families, so maybe the risks were less for them. But yeah, those people have grown up feeling able to be different in lots of ways. So able to be outspoken, but also able to be different in all sorts of ways that back in their youth might not have been so acceptable. And as I said before, most people more people would watch something like Newsnight or Question Time, or take part in political events, rather than watch some of the television programs that they used to. I think it's genuinely made a difference. There's more engagement with our local parish council. There's more diversity on our parish council since that. And I do think that that's a reflection of what happens in Brightlingsea, and that's a good thing. You know, people have had their eyes opened and they don't want them to be closed again. They don't trust closing them again because they know that things happen. I mean, on the very first evening when lorries came through, very first morning when lorries came through, the mayor was on Newsnight that night talking about the fact that his wife and daughter had been pulled apart by their hair by two policemen, and that he couldn't find his daughter. And he was very, very distressed. Our Tory mayor standing there on Newsnight, really, really upset. And it affected people, you know, people who'd known him for years. He runs a lot of the town's sailing outlets, and people trusted him and liked him. He's a perfectly nice guy. But their politics were thrown into disarray because they assumed if you were the wife of a Tory mayor, that wouldn't happen to you, and it happened.
I think it was really interesting because doing the research, I keep coming back to it, but there's so many different things that kind of came up. And one of the things that I found really interesting was, this idea of awakening. And lots of people I spoke to, yes, but I interviewed a woman who was not somebody, you know, she was quite elderly, and she kind of had pictures of the monarchy all over her walls and stuff, but she started talking about how she was like a lifelong vegetarian and she hated the police now, and she was like, it was amazing seeing, and before that she'd been very kind of conservative. But on the other hand, recently we posted a video in a Brightlingsea community group that was footage of the protests, and we were just trying to find out who'd posted, whose footage it was basically, and immediately the response was, and we hadn't even mentioned race, but in the comments people were writing things about how the Black Lives Matter movement could learn a thing or two from Brightlingsea, and it was kind of it was just amazing that kind of came up, and I think that was, yeah, so I don't know, that's kind of more of an observation, but if you have any thoughts on that, or I suppose it was interesting thinking about rural communities, and especially sort of very white working class, middle class communities, kind of often the kind of the mix and the cross section of ideas and views.
So Brightlingsea has changed a lot. So there are two Syrian families who moved to Brightlingsea around 3.5 years ago. And when the county council were placing them there, they were like, oh, that's a bit near to Clacton. We're not sure about that. Will they be safe? And they have been entirely welcomed and made to feel part of this community. They've been absolutely incredible themselves, did a lot of, one of the families has a small catering business, did a lot of cooking for carers and old people's homes during the first lockdown and taking food to people. So they've worked very hard to make sure that they're part of this community. But the acceptance that they found, to me, was astonishing. Having lived here previously, I was very surprised at how well it went. And I think that is also a reflection of how people are changing in general. But yeah, I very much doubt that the Black Lives Matter protests could learn much from Brightlingsea. I think they're doing fine on their own.
Yeah, that's what I think.
I didn't mean that. I meant that it was interesting. Yeah. People say.
No, I know you didn't mean it, but somebody else meant it.
Yeah. Just to clarify. Well, I think we'd probably wrap up there, but just before we end, is there anything that you'd like to add, or, you know, if there's one kind of message or one thing that you would like to get across, maybe we could go around everyone, that people could either take from the Brightlingsea protest, or that you'd like people, even if it's an action, so it could be something like a tangible practical action, or just kind of a thing to bear in mind. Is there something that you would like people to take away from today? So maybe starting with Helen.
Oh goodness, I think this has been a great conversation. Thanks for having me. I think it reminds me how important staying active, finding your voice is for all of us, and how we need to keep doing that. But I wanted to pick up on what Joyce was talking about earlier on, the way we eat, what we eat. massively shapes the world and other people's prospects. It all joins up. So I think, you know, it's staying involved in these issues and thinking about what we consume and where it comes from and what impacts it has, particularly around meat, would be really good.
Maybe going then to Maria.
So some of the things you said about talking to people from some animal rights groups and not liking some of the language you've heard, for me, I've always had an issue with that. I am vegan. I don't have any issues with people who are not vegan. It's a personal choice. I strongly believe that every single living being is worthy of respect. And it doesn't matter if that is somebody who's from the National Front. I would never hurt anybody for their beliefs. I do believe that by talking to people and joining with them in common issues, we can create a narrative that includes everybody and brings them together. So I want to preach a little bit of kindness and inclusion of everybody.
Thank you. And Anita?
I think Maria's point is amazing about kindness, especially in the activism community. I think it's really important, especially now that we have a lot more online activism, that it shows that everyone can get involved, and it opens up the space for a lot of people to get involved, and you can build friendships, you build a sense of community, even though you don't see them every day. So I think it's really important that people kind of take the initiative to start reading, start looking at things, and start getting involved. Even if it's just a tiny step, it can lead to a lot of bigger things.
Thank you. And Juliette?
Well, I think Bail and their protests are a case study in how to run a really successful campaign. And also another thing that struck me is it's a case study for powerful women, which is just so great to see. And when I was looking through my notes, I keep going on about this, I've just like really gone back to 1995 reading through my cuttings. It was the thing that Billy Bragg commented on. He was struck by the number of women in charge and the number of women taking part. And what I think is that why it was so successful?
And lastly, Joyce.
Well, it's funny, today I came across yet another quote from Martin Luther King, because it was Martin Luther King Day this week. And I actually wrote it down so I could kind of put it somewhere. And it says, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. And so I do think it's really important to speak up, but always with respect for other people. Because if you don't respect them and just shout at them, you never persuade them with your point of view. So I totally agree with Maria about that. Speak to everyone you can and just find out more about the connections between climate, biodiversity loss, animal welfare, food security for people on low incomes, desertification. All these issues are so linked up, and they all have, a common factor in us as human beings: what we decide to eat, what we decide to wear, to drive, etc., etc. So, we need to kind of have a little look at our own lives from time to time. And I'm not perfect, and I don't suppose anybody is, but just seeing if there are things we can tweak and make a little bit better. But as I say, absolutely always talking with respect, firmly, but with respect to those we totally disagree with.
Thank you so much. That was such a great note to end on. Thank you so much to all our panelists. I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking you all for such a great kind of range of different conversations and connecting the past with the present and the future. And thank you to everyone for coming and for supporting the play. Just to let you know, if anyone's ordered a play copy as well as a ticket, I'll be getting in touch or have got in touch to ask for your postal address so I can send that out. And stay tuned for the play in 2021. Fingers crossed.
Thank you, Polly.
Thank you.
Yeah, well done, everybody. Fantastic.
Take care.